Have you ever felt like giving up on learning English because nothing seems to work? One rainy night in the United States, my car suddenly broke down on a dark road. I was tired, frustrated, and ready to quit everything. But then my neighbors came outside, helped me, and started a simple English conversation that changed my confidence, my motivation, and even the way I see life. A rainy night begins. What would you do if the moment you felt most tired of learning English, life suddenly gave you a real conversation you could not escape? Not inside a classroom, not inside an app, but outside, in the rain, with a broken car and strangers watching you from their windows. That strange moment happened to me on a quiet street in the United States. And believe it or not, that rainy night became one of the most powerful English lessons of my life. The night began like many ordinary evenings. Work was finished. My body felt heavy. My brain felt even heavier. The sky was gray, and rain had been falling since late afternoon. By the time I started driving home, the streets were already shining with reflections from streetlights. Rain in America can be dramatic. Not the gentle rain you imagine in romantic movies. This rain sounded loud and impatient, hitting the windshield again and again like someone knocking on a door. The windshield wipers moved left and right, trying their best to keep the glass clear. But the road still looked blurry. My hands stayed on the steering wheel, but my thoughts were somewhere else completely. English. Learning English had been part of my routine for years. Some days felt exciting. You learn a new word. You understand a sentence in a movie. You feel proud for a few minutes. Other days feel very different. You listen carefully but still miss half the words. You try speaking, but your tongue suddenly forgets everything. And that evening, my brain had clearly chosen the second type of day. Earlier at home, I tried to practice listening with a short English story. The speaker talked slowly. The sentences were simple. But after a few minutes, my attention quietly disappeared. My eyes stared at the kitchen wall while the audio continued playing. My brain had already escaped the lesson. There is actually a scientific reason for this. The human brain is designed to save energy. When something feels difficult or repetitive, the brain looks for an easier activity. Psychologists sometimes call this mental resistance. Language learning requires the opposite: focus, patience, tolerance for confusion. And sometimes your brain simply refuses to cooperate. That was exactly my situation that evening. The rain became stronger as I turned onto the street where I lived. Water ran along the sides of the road like thin silver rivers. Trees moved slowly in the wind, and the houses looked calm and quiet behind glowing windows. Inside those homes, families were probably eating dinner, laughing, watching television. Meanwhile, I was alone in my car, tired and thinking about how long the road of learning English still felt. Then something unexpected happened. The car made a strange sound. At first it was small, just a soft cough from the engine. I frowned and listened carefully. Another sound followed. This one louder. The engine shook slightly. Drivers develop a strange relationship with their cars over time. Machines speak in small warnings before real problems arrive. A tiny sound can mean nothing, or it can mean trouble is coming very soon. I gently pressed the gas pedal. Nothing. The car hesitated like a runner who suddenly forgot how to run. Then came a low groaning sound. The kind of sound that makes your stomach drop because you know something is wrong. A second later, the engine stopped completely. Silence. The windshield wipers continued moving slowly across the glass, but the car itself had lost its voice. I guided the car toward the side of the road and stopped. Rain hammered on the roof. For a moment, I simply sat there, staring forward through the wet windshield. No music. No engine. Only rain. A deep sigh escaped my chest. Seriously? I whispered. Sometimes frustration arrives all at once. Work stress, tiredness, doubts about your progress, and now a broken car in the middle of a rainy night. My brain quickly suggested a familiar solution. Quit trying. Stop worrying about improvement for a while. Just go home, sleep, and forget about everything. Psychologists say the brain loves this idea. It is called the avoidance response. When something becomes difficult, the brain searches for an exit, a comfortable exit. But comfortable exits rarely lead anywhere interesting. I finally opened the car door. Cold rain immediately landed on my jacket. The wind pushed droplets against my face. Within seconds, my shoulders were wet.
Great.
Exactly what this evening needed. I walked to the front of the car and pulled the hood release. The hood slowly lifted. Warm air escaped from the engine like a tired breath. Now I was standing in the rain, staring at a complicated machine full of wires and metal pieces I clearly did not understand. Human beings do something funny in situations like this. Even when we know nothing about engines, we still look inside the hood as if wisdom might magically appear. So I stood there pretending to examine the engines seriously. Rain continued falling. The street remained quiet. Then something small changed. Across the street, a light turned on inside one of the houses. A soft yellow glow appeared behind a window. Someone had noticed me. I did not realize it yet, but that tiny light was about to start a conversation that would change my confidence, my motivation, and the way I practiced English forever. And it would all begin with a simple moment. A broken car. A rainy night. And neighbors I had never spoken to before. Alone on a dark road. Rain has a strange way of making the world feel bigger and smaller at the same time. Bigger, because the darkness stretches farther than usual. Smaller, because everything outside your tiny circle of light disappears. That night, my circle of light was the weak glow from a street lamp above my car. The rain kept falling, steady and patient, as if it had nowhere else to be. I stood there next to the open hood, pretending to understand the engine. Water dripped from my hair onto the metal parts below. My jacket was already wet, and the cold air slowly slipped through the fabric. For a moment, I just listened. Rain hitting the road, wind moving through the trees. The quiet hum of houses where people were warm and comfortable. And then a very familiar thought quietly walked into my mind. This is exactly how learning English feels. Strange comparison, right? But the feeling was identical. Standing alone, looking at something complicated, trying to understand a system that seems built for someone smarter than you. Many language learners experience this stage. Researchers in language psychology call it the frustration plateau. At the beginning, progress feels fast. You learn basic words. You memorize greetings. You can introduce yourself. But later something changes. Progress becomes slower. Your brain hears English, but it still feels blurry. Just like the road through my rain-covered windshield. You catch a few words, miss the rest. Your confidence drops. And suddenly, standing next to a broken car in the rain feels like a perfect metaphor. I leaned forward and looked deeper into the engine, even though I had absolutely no idea what I was searching for. Maybe a loose wire? Maybe magic? My brain started doing something interesting. Instead of solving the problem, it started replaying old frustrations. That awkward conversation last week when I misunderstood a simple question. The moment at work when everyone laughed at a joke I didn't understand. The long nights practicing pronunciation while feeling like my mouth was made of wood. If you've studied a second language, you probably know this mental movie. Your brain becomes a director of failure highlights. And in that moment, standing under the rain, I felt a quiet wave of doubt. Maybe I'm not good at this. Funny how the brain connects unrelated problems. A broken car suddenly becomes proof that your entire life is difficult. Psychologists call this cognitive exaggeration. When stress appears, the brain expands it like a balloon. One small problem becomes 10 problems. The rain continued falling. I closed the hood gently and leaned against the side of the car. The street looked empty again. No cars passing.
No footsteps.
Just quiet houses and glowing windows. One part of my brain suggested something logical. Call a tow truck. That was clearly the practical solution. But another part of my brain kept staring at the house across the street where the light had turned on. Someone had noticed me. The window curtain moved slightly. Maybe someone was watching. And suddenly a new type of anxiety appeared.
Talking.
In English. Now here's something interesting about the human brain. Scientists studying language learning discovered that fear of speaking is often stronger than fear of making mistakes. In other words, many learners don't avoid English because they don't know the words. They avoid English because they imagine embarrassment. Your brain starts predicting disasters. What if I say something wrong? What if they don't understand me? What if my accent sounds strange? Standing next to my car that night, those exact thoughts started lining up inside my head. Even though the situation was simple, just neighbors, just a conversation. But the brain loves drama. I imagine knocking on the door and forgetting every English sentence I had ever learned. Hello. Car broken rain, sorry, words gone. Not exactly impressive communication. A small laugh escaped me. The situation was ridiculous. Here I was living in the United States, practicing English for years, and still feeling nervous about a simple conversation with a neighbor. The rain softened slightly, turning from loud drops into a steady whisper. Across the street, the light inside the house grew brighter. Then something moved behind the window again. A shadow. Someone was definitely there. Watching the strange person standing next to a broken car in the rain, I suddenly realized something simple. If I were inside that house, I would probably be curious too. Humans are naturally curious creatures. A study from the University of California once showed that curiosity activates the same reward centers in the brain as food or music. In other words, curiosity literally feels good, which meant my neighbors might be feeling curious right now. Curious about the soaked stranger next to the car. Curious enough to possibly walk outside. And if that happened,
well,
then English practice would become unavoidable. A small gust of wind pushed rain across the street. My shoes were completely wet now. Cold water slowly crept through the fabric. Fantastic. This evening had clearly decided to test my patience. I looked one more time at the quiet houses around me, then back at my silent car, then up at the dark sky. Sometimes life places you in situations that feel inconvenient, uncomfortable, even annoying. But hidden inside those moments is something interesting. Opportunity. Not the kind that arrives with music and fireworks. The quiet kind. The kind that begins with a light turning on in a window. At that exact moment, the front door of the house across the street slowly opened. Warm yellow light spilled onto the wet driveway, and a voice called out into the rain. "Hey, are you okay over there?" My brain froze. The English lesson had just begun. A light from the house. "Hey, are you okay over there?" The voice came through the rain, calm and friendly, but my brain reacted like someone had suddenly turned on a spotlight in a dark theater. For a split second, I forgot how language works. My mind knew the words. My ears understood the sentence. But my mouth decided to panic. This happens more often than people admit. You understand English perfectly when listening to a video or reading a story. But when a real person suddenly talks to you, your brain presses the emergency button. Everything you learned hides somewhere inside your memory, like shy children behind a curtain. I turned toward the voice. Standing at the edge of the driveway across the street was a man in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. He wore a gray jacket and held a small flashlight in his hand. The light moved slightly as he walked closer, creating bright circles on the wet pavement. Behind him, the warm glow from his house stretched into the rainy night like an invitation. For a moment, I simply raised one hand and gave a small wave, a universal human language. Then I tried to answer. Yes, I think so. Not exactly a perfect response, but at least it was English. The man walked a few steps closer, stopping near the sidewalk between our houses. Rain fell on the hood of my car, creating a steady rhythm. "That your car?" he asked. Simple sentence. My brain relaxed slightly. "Yes," I said. My car stopped working. Good.
Short. Clear.
Sometimes learners think they must speak with long, complex sentences to sound intelligent. But real communication often prefers the opposite. Short sentences. Clear ideas. The man nodded and aimed the flashlight toward the open hood of my car. Happened suddenly? Yes, I replied. It just stopped. He stepped closer, crossing the street without hesitation, the rain landing on his shoulders. Mind if I take a look? He asked. Another simple sentence. Another moment where my brain quietly celebrated. No problem, I said quickly. Please. While he walked toward the car, something interesting happened inside my head. The fear I had imagined earlier began shrinking. This is actually supported by psychology research. Studies on exposure therapy show that anxiety decreases when we face the situation we fear instead of avoiding it. In other words, the brain often exaggerates the danger of speaking. Reality is usually much kinder. The man reached the front of the car and leaned slightly under the hood. The flashlight beam moved across the engine like a small explorer searching for clues. Name's Mark, he said casually. Nice to meet you, Mark. My name is Alex. The rain softened a little, becoming a steady drizzle instead of a heavy shower. Mark tapped a metal piece inside the engine gently. How long you been in the neighborhood? He asked. That question forced my brain to build a longer sentence. I paused for half a second. About 2 years now. 2 years? He said with a small smile. Guess we're neighbors and never met properly. He wasn't wrong. Modern life does something strange to neighborhoods. People live only a few meters away from each other, but weeks or even years pass without real conversations. Everyone stays busy. Everyone stays inside. But a broken car in the rain apparently works as an excellent introduction. Mark continued looking at the engine. Were you from originally? He asked. Now that question required a bit more explanation. My family moved here a few years ago, I said slowly. We came for work and school. The words came out carefully, like stepping stones across a river.
Mark nodded again.
Well, welcome to the most unpredictable weather in the state, he joked, pointing at the sky. I laughed. It felt surprisingly natural. And that was the moment I noticed something fascinating. My English was working. Not perfect, not elegant, but functional. And that is actually the true goal of communication. Linguists often explain that communication success does not depend on perfect grammar. It depends on shared meaning. If the other person understands you, the mission is complete. Mark straightened up from the engine and wiped rainwater from his forehead. Battery looks okay, he said, but something else might be wrong. I nodded, even though I still had no idea what he was examining. But something more important was happening. My brain had shifted from fear mode into conversation mode. Researchers call this the comfort threshold. After a few successful exchanges, the brain begins trusting the situation. Confidence slowly grows. Mark leaned against the side of the car next to me. You live alone? He asked.
No, Iraplía.
My family lives with me. My wife and our kids. Kids, he said with interest. Yes, I said with a smile. 2. Mark chuckled. Then you definitely need that car working. We both laughed again. Rain dripped from the edges of the hood, landing on the ground between us. The quiet street no longer felt lonely. It felt connected. Then Mark glanced back toward his house. A silhouette appeared at the doorway. Another person. Probably his wife. He raised his hand and waved toward the house. Then he looked back at me.
Tell you what, he said.
Why don't you come inside for a minute? My wife just made coffee. Coffee. Warmth. Shelter from the rain. And most importantly, more conversation. That simple invitation was about to turn a random car problem into a night I would remember for years. And strangely enough, into one of the best English practice sessions of my life. Simple English conversation. The most surprising English lessons rarely happen inside classrooms. They happen when your brain has no time to prepare. Standing in the rain next to my broken car, I suddenly realized something simple. The conversation was already happening. There was no pause button. No chance to open a dictionary. No time to translate every word in my head. Real English had arrived, and it was moving forward whether I felt ready or not. Mark closed the hood of my car gently and gestured toward his house across the street. Come on, he said with an easy smile. You're going to freeze out here. The rain had become lighter, but the cold air was still sharp. My jacket was wet, my shoes were soaked, and the idea of warm coffee sounded like the greatest invention in human history. Thank you, I replied. We walked across the quiet street together. Something interesting happens when you walk with someone in silence. Your brain starts organizing thoughts, preparing possible sentences, rehearsing words you might need soon. Language learners do this constantly. You start predicting the conversation before it even begins. What if he asks about my job? What if his wife asks where I'm from? What if I forget a word? Your brain becomes a tiny rehearsal theater. But here is the funny truth psychologists often mention. Most of those imagined conversations never happen. Reality tends to be simpler. When we reached the front porch, warm yellow light spilled from the open door. Inside the house, everything looked calm and comfortable. The smell of coffee floated through the air. Mark stepped inside and held the door open.
Come in.
The warmth hit my face immediately. If you have ever come inside from cold rain, you know that feeling. Your shoulders relax without asking permission. Your breathing slows down. Your body feels grateful. Standing in the hallway was a woman with kind eyes and silver hair tied loosely behind her head. "This must be our stranded neighbor," she said with a gentle laugh. Her voice sounded warm and calm, the kind of voice that immediately makes a place feel welcoming. Mark pointed toward me. "This is Alex," he said. "Car trouble?" The woman nodded. "I'm Linda," she said. "Nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too," I answered.
Simple. Clear.
Conversation number 3 completed successfully. That small moment gave my brain another boost of confidence. You see, every successful exchange in a second language sends a signal to the brain. You survived. And survival is powerful motivation. Linda walked toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yes, please," I said quickly. The kitchen looked warm and peaceful. A soft light hung above the table. A pot of coffee sat on the counter, and steam slowly rose into the air. Outside, rain continued falling quietly against the windows. Inside, the world felt completely different. Mark pulled out a chair for me. "So," he said, sitting down across the table, "tell me the story of that car." Now, this was interesting. A story, not just a short answer. My brain paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "Well," I began slowly. "I was driving home from work. Everything was normal. Then the engine started making strange noises." Mark nodded while listening. This is another important part of conversation many learners forget. Listening phases matter. Good listeners show interest with small reactions. Nodding, smiling, short sounds like "uh-huh" or "I see." These signals tell your brain something comforting. The other person understands you. I continued. And then the car stopped completely. Linda placed a mug of coffee in front of me.
"Here you go," she said.
"Thank you." The warmth of the cup spread through my cold fingers instantly. Mark leaned back in his chair. "Happens more often than people think," he said. "Cars love dramatic timing." I laughed again. Another simple sentence. Another successful moment. Then Linda asked a question that changed the direction of the conversation. "So, how long have you been practicing English?" My brain blinked. That question felt very direct. "Several years," I said honestly. "You speak very clearly," she said. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I heard her correctly. "Really?" I asked. "Of course," she replied. "You're easy to understand." That small compliment did something powerful inside my mind. Language researchers often say that positive feedback accelerates language confidence. When learners hear encouragement from real people, not teachers, not textbooks, the brain becomes more willing to take risks. And language learning is full of small risks. Speaking before you feel ready. Trying sentences that might not be perfect. Linda sat down across from me. What helped you learn the most? She asked. I thought about it. Textbooks?
Grammar exercises?
Vocabulary lists? Then something surprising came out of my mouth. Stories, I said. Mark raised an eyebrow. Stories? Yes, I explained. Listening to simple stories in English helps me remember words better. Linda smiled. That makes sense. Humans love stories. She wasn't wrong. Neuroscience research shows that the brain processes stories differently from raw information. When we hear a story, multiple areas of the brain activate: memory, emotion, imagination. Stories make language alive. Mark took a sip of coffee. Well, he said, sounds like tonight just gave you a new one. He pointed toward the window where my car sat quietly under the rain. A broken car, a rainy street, 2 neighbors, and an unexpected English conversation. He was right. This strange night was slowly becoming a story worth telling. And the best part? The night was only getting started. Warm coffee and warm hearts. Warm coffee has a strange ability to slow time. Outside the window, the rain continued tapping softly against the glass, but inside Mark and Linda's kitchen the world felt calm. The air smelled like roasted coffee beans and fresh bread. A small lamp above the table created a golden circle of light that made everything look peaceful. My soaked jacket hung over the back of the chair, slowly drying. My hands wrapped around the mug like it was a small heater. For a moment, nobody spoke. And strangely, the silence didn't feel awkward. That is something many English learners misunderstand. Silence in conversation is not always a problem. Native speakers pause too. The brain often needs a few seconds to think, organize ideas, and prepare the next sentence. Mark finally leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window. Still raining, he said. Yes, I replied.
A lot.
Simple sentences again. But those simple exchanges were doing something powerful. They were training my brain to stay inside English mode. Linguists explain that language learners often switch between 2 mental systems, one for their native language and one for the new language. When conversation continues smoothly, the brain slowly stops translating and begins thinking directly in the new language. And that was exactly what was starting to happen to me. Linda placed a small plate of cookies on the table. Help yourself, she said. Thank you. I took one and smiled awkwardly. Hospitality in American homes can sometimes surprise newcomers. In many neighborhoods, people value privacy, but when someone needs help, kindness appears quickly. Linda folded her hands on the table and looked at me with curiosity. So, she said, tell us about your family. That question instantly warmed my heart. My wife and our 2 kids live with me, I answered. They moved here with me a few years ago. Mark nodded. How old are the kids? 10 and 7. Good ages, he said with a soft laugh. Still young enough to think their parents know everything. We all laughed. Linda smiled and asked another question. Do they like living here? Yes, I said. At first everything was new for them. New school, new language, but children learn fast. That statement is actually supported by research. Studies in language development show that children often acquire new languages faster than adults because their brains are still highly flexible. Scientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections. Adults can still learn languages very well, but we tend to think more, analyze more, and sometimes worry more. Children simply try. Mark pointed his cookie at me like a small microphone. And what about you? He asked. Was it difficult at the beginning? I laughed quietly. Yes, I admitted. Very difficult. The memory of those early days returned clearly. Understanding almost nothing in conversations. Reading signs slowly. Feeling nervous every time someone asked a question. But something interesting happened. I continued. Mark leaned forward slightly. What's that? I realized that real conversations teach more than textbooks. Linda nodded thoughtfully. That's true for many skills, she said. And she was right. Educational psychologists often emphasize the power of context learning. When language appears inside real-life situations, stories, emotions, relationships, the brain remembers it more easily. Grammar rules alone rarely create strong memories, but moments do. Like a rainy night with a broken car. Mark glanced at the window again, and then back at me. You know, he said, this neighborhood used to be much quieter. Quieter? I asked. Fewer families. Mostly older couples like us. Linda chuckled. And now we have kids playing basketball down the street every afternoon. I smiled. My son might be one of them. Well then, Mark said, he's helping keep the neighborhood alive. That sentence made me feel something unexpected. Belonging. Sometimes immigrants worry about fitting into new communities. The language barrier can create invisible walls. But that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with two neighbors I had never spoken to before, those walls felt much smaller. Linda took a sip of her coffee and asked another question. Did you practice English every day? I thought for a moment. Almost every day, I said. But sometimes motivation disappears. Mark laughed loudly. That happens to everyone. Even native speakers struggle with motivation for different goals. Exercise, reading, learning skills. The brain prefers comfort. Motivation often fades when progress feels slow. Linda rested her elbow on the table. What helps you continue? She asked. I looked down at the coffee for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Stories like this, I said. Mark raised an eyebrow again. This story? Yes, I explained. Real moments help me remember why learning English matters. Language is not only grammar. It is connection. It is laughter with neighbors. It is solving problems together. It is sharing coffee on a rainy night. Mark smiled slowly. Well, he said, pointing toward the window again. We still need to solve the problem outside. Ah, yes. The car. I had almost forgotten about it. But the night was far from finished. Mark stood up and grabbed a small toolbox from the corner of the kitchen. I have an idea, he said. Linda shook her head with a playful smile. That means we're going back into the rain. Mark laughed. Just for a few minutes. He looked at me. Ready to see if we can wake your car up? I stood up from the table. Warm coffee. Warm conversation. And now, an unexpected mechanical adventure. The English lesson was about to continue, this time under the open hood of a stubborn car. Learning through real life. Real learning rarely feels like learning. It feels like living. A strange conversation, a small problem, an unexpected moment that forces your brain to react faster than your doubts. That rainy night was quietly turning into one of those moments. Mark grabbed a flashlight and his old metal toolbox. The tools inside made a soft clinking sound as he lifted it. Linda handed him a small towel. "You'll need this," she said. Mark chuckled. "You say that like I'm about to fight the rain." "Knowing you," Linda replied, "you probably will." We stepped back outside. The rain had slowed down, but the street was still wet and shiny under the streetlights. The air smelled fresh, like wet asphalt and cold wind. My car waited exactly where we left it, silent and stubborn. Mark walked toward the hood with the confidence of someone who had fixed many things in his life. Now here's something interesting about real-world learning. When you watch a video lesson or read a textbook, the brain knows it is studying. It becomes careful, analytical, sometimes even nervous. But when you are simply living a moment, solving a problem, helping someone, telling a story, your brain relaxes. Language flows naturally because communication becomes the priority. That was exactly what was happening now. Mark placed the toolbox on the ground and opened the hood again. "Let's see what we're dealing with," he said. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the engine. "Turn the key for me," he asked. I sat inside the car and turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed weakly. Then silence. Mark leaned closer to the engine, listening carefully. "Okay," he said. "Turn it off." I stepped back outside. "Well?" I asked. He scratched his chin. "Could be a few things," he said calmly. Now here is the funny part. Even though I understood the sentence, my brain instantly created a dramatic movie again. A few things suddenly sounded like 100 expensive problems. This is another psychological trick the brain likes to play. When information is incomplete, the brain fills the gaps with imagination, usually negative imagination. Mark, however, looked completely relaxed. He tapped a small cable near the battery. "How old is this car?" he asked. "About 8 years," I answered. He nodded slowly. "That's about the age when cars start asking for attention." We both laughed. Linda appeared at the front door and called out from the porch. "Do you need more light?" "We're good," Mark shouted back. She leaned against the doorframe, watching us with curiosity. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving only tiny drops falling from the tree branches. Mark picked up a small wrench and gently tightened a metal connector. "Cars are funny machines," he said while working. "Most of the time they behave perfectly. Then suddenly they decide to test your patience." I nodded. "That sounds like learning English." Mark laughed loudly. "You're not wrong." That simple joke contained more truth than many language lessons. Language learning is exactly like that. Long periods of progress followed by confusing moments when everything seems to break. Researchers studying skill development often describe something called the learning plateau. At certain stages, progress becomes invisible even though the brain is still improving. You feel stuck. But beneath the surface, new connections are forming. Mark wiped his hands on the towel Linda gave him. "Try the key again," he said. I stepped back into the driver's seat. My heart beat slightly faster. Turning the key felt like pulling the lever on a slot machine. The engine turned once.
Twice.
Then, nothing. Silence again. I stepped out of the car with a small sigh. Mark shrugged. Not that one. He didn't sound disappointed. In fact, he looked amused. You know, he said, leaning against the car, fixing machines and learning languages have something in common. Oh, I asked. You learn by trying things, he said, not by worrying about them. That sentence landed in my mind like a small spark. Because he was right. So many language learners spend years preparing to speak instead of actually speaking. They collect vocabulary. They study grammar. But they wait for the perfect moment to start conversations. The perfect moment rarely arrives. Mark returned to the engine and adjusted another small component. Life is a lot like this, he continued. You try something. If it doesn't work, you try something else. The flashlight beam reflected off the wet metal parts. Same with English, he added. I smiled. A mechanical repair had quietly turned into a life lesson. Mark tightened one more connector and stepped back. All right, he said. Let's give it one more shot. I walked back into the car again. Rainwater dripped slowly from the hood. The street was quiet. Linda stood on the porch, watching like an audience member waiting for the final act of a play. I placed my hand on the key. Mark raised his thumb. Go for it. I turned the key. The engine hesitated, coughed, and suddenly, it roared back to life. The sound filled the quiet street like a small victory song. Mark laughed and slapped the hood of the car. There we go. Relief rushed through my chest. The car was alive again, but something else had also changed. Standing there in the cool night air, listening to the steady engine, I realized something important. The real lesson of the evening was not about cars. And it wasn't even about English grammar. It was about something much simpler. Sometimes the best language practice begins with a problem. A story about love. The engine was running again, humming softly like a machine that had finally decided to forgive the night. Rainwater still dripped slowly from the hood, and the streetlights reflected on the wet road like long golden lines. For a few seconds, none of us said anything. We just listened to the sound of the engine, steady, alive, almost proud of itself. Mark closed the hood with a gentle push. Well, he said with a satisfied smile, looks like your car decided to cooperate. I laughed, relief spreading through my chest.
Thank you, I said.
Seriously, I thought I might be standing in the rain all night. Mark wiped his hands with the towel Linda had given him earlier. Sometimes machines just need a little attention, he replied. Linda walked down from the porch and joined us beside the car. The rain had almost stopped completely now, leaving the air cool and fresh. You two look like you solved a mystery, she said. Mark chuckled. Nothing dramatic. Just a loose connection. Linda nodded slowly and then looked at me with a curious smile. So, Alex, she said, does your family worry when you come home late like this? That simple question changed the direction of the conversation in an unexpected way. My wife probably is, I admitted. She knows the weather is bad tonight. Linda leaned against the side of the car. How long have you been married? 11 years, I answered. Mark let out a soft whistle. 11 years. That's a good run. I laughed. I hope it continues. The three of us stood there for a moment, the quiet neighborhood wrapping around us like a calm blanket. A few distant cars passed on a nearby road, but our street remained peaceful. Linda smiled at Mark. "You know," she said playfully, "this reminds me of the night we met." Mark looked at her with the expression of someone remembering an old movie scene. "Oh wow," he said slowly. "I haven't thought about that story in years." My curiosity immediately woke up. "You met in the rain too?" I asked. Mark laughed loudly. "Not exactly, but the situation was just as inconvenient." Linda crossed her arms and looked at him. "Go ahead," she said. "Tell him." Mark leaned against the car like a storyteller preparing for a long tale. "Well," he began, "this happened almost 40 years ago." 40 years. The number alone made the story feel special. "I was driving an old pickup truck back then," he continued. "A terrible truck. Loud, rusty, and always breaking down." Linda smiled, clearly enjoying the memory. "One night," Mark said, "I stopped at a small diner on the edge of town because the truck was overheating. I imagined the scene in my mind, a quiet American diner glowing under neon lights, somewhere along a dark highway. When I walked inside," Mark continued, "there was only one other person sitting at the counter." He pointed at Linda. "Her." Linda raised her eyebrows. "And he looked completely lost," she said. Mark laughed. "I was not lost. I was thinking." "You were staring at the menu for 10 minutes, Linda replied. We all laughed. But something deeper was hiding inside that simple memory. Stories have a strange power. When people tell them, emotions from the past quietly return. You can see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices." Mark continued. "I finally asked the waitress what she recommended," he said. And Linda here turned around and said, "If you want good pie, don't order the apple." Linda nodded proudly. I was saving him from disappointment. "So, I followed her advice," Mark said. "We started talking, then talking more." The quiet street seemed to disappear as the story unfolded. 3 hours later, Mark continued, the diner was closing, my truck was still overheating, and I realized something. "What?" I asked. He looked at Linda. I didn't want the conversation to end. Linda's smile softened. "That was the beginning," she said quietly. I felt something warm in my chest listening to their story. Love stories don't always begin with grand gestures. Sometimes they begin with small conversations, a question, a joke, a shared moment of inconvenience. Psychologists who study relationships often say that strong partnerships are built on simple interactions repeated over time, shared meals, small acts of help, everyday conversations, not dramatic movie scenes, real-life moments, like this rainy night. Mark looked back at me. "So now it's your turn," he said. "My turn?" I asked. "Yes," Linda added. "How did you meet your wife?" The question felt both simple and meaningful. I looked up at the dark sky for a moment. "My story started in a classroom," I said slowly. "English class." Mark laughed immediately. "Of course it did. But the truth was deeper than that. That classroom had been the beginning of a journey, learning a new language, moving to a new country, building a family in a place that once felt unfamiliar. Standing there next to my repaired car, I realized something surprising. This rainy night wasn't just about car trouble anymore. It had turned into something else entirely. A conversation about life, about love, about the strange paths that bring people together. And somewhere inside that conversation, another English lesson was quietly forming. Because language is not only about words, it is about the stories we share. Family, children, and culture. The rain had completely stopped now. The street looked calm again, almost like the storm had only existed to bring three people together beside one stubborn car. The engine was still running quietly, sending a soft vibration through the metal frame. Warm air drifted out from under the hood, disappearing into the cool night. Linda crossed her arms comfortably and looked at me with curiosity. "So," she said gently, "you mentioned meeting your wife in an English class." Mark leaned against the car again. "That sounds like the beginning of a good story." I laughed quietly. "It was not very dramatic," I said. Mark smiled. "The best stories never are." That sentence stayed in my mind for a moment. Real life rarely begins with fireworks. It usually begins with ordinary moments, classrooms, coffee shops, small conversations. My wife and I were both learning English at the time. I explained slowly. We sat in the same classroom for months before we actually talked. Linda tilted her head. "Really?" "Yes," I said, smiling at the memory. "We were both shy." Mark chuckled. "That sounds familiar." Learning a new language creates a strange situation for adults. Even confident people suddenly feel like beginners again. You want to express your thoughts clearly, but your vocabulary feels small. Your personality is big, but your sentences are tiny. Psychologists call this language identity gap. Your mind has complex ideas, but your language skills temporarily limit how you express them. And sometimes that makes people quieter than they normally are. But one day, I continued. Our teacher gave us a small speaking exercise. Linda leaned forward slightly. "What kind of exercise?" "We had to ask another student simple questions in English." Mark smiled. The classic conversation practice." "Yes," I laughed. And she was sitting next to me. The memory felt warm and a little funny now. "At first we spoke very slowly," I said. "Like this." I exaggerated the rhythm slightly. "Hello, how are you today?" Linda laughed softly. "That sounds like every language class ever." But something interesting happened. I continued. Mark raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" We kept talking even after the exercise finished. Linda smiled knowingly. That's how it starts. The human brain is naturally curious about other people. When two people begin sharing small pieces of their lives, conversations grow naturally. First simple questions, then stories, then emotions. Psychologists who study relationships often explain that emotional connection grows through repeated small conversations, not through one dramatic moment. That was exactly what happened with us. We started meeting after class, I said. Sometimes just to practice English. Mark laughed. Practicing English, huh? I smiled. Yes, practicing. Linda gently nudged him with her elbow. Let him finish. I continued. At first we talked about simple things, food, school, work. Then I paused for a moment, remembering something important. But the more we talked, the more we understood each other. Mark nodded slowly. Language does that. And he was right. Language is more than vocabulary. It is a bridge. It allows two people from different backgrounds to share experiences, hopes, fears, and dreams. Linda looked toward the quiet houses along the street. So, what was the biggest change when you moved here? She asked. That question made me think.
There were many, I said.
Weather, culture, even small daily habits. Mark pointed toward the neighborhood houses. Like what? Well, I explained. In some places neighbors visit each other often without planning. Linda smiled. And here? Here people usually call first, I said. We all laughed. It was a simple cultural difference, but a real one. Every country has its own rhythm of social life. Some cultures value spontaneity. Others value privacy. Neither is right or wrong. They are simply different. My children noticed the differences faster than we did. I added. How so? Linda asked. Kids adapt quickly, I said. They learned English faster than we did. That statement is supported by many studies. Children's brains are extremely flexible when learning sounds and patterns in language. Within months, they can often understand conversations that adults struggle with for years. My daughter started correcting my pronunciation, I said with a laugh. Mark laughed loudly. That must have been humbling. Yes, I said. Very humbling. But it was also beautiful, because language learning inside a family becomes something shared. Children help parents. Parents help children. Everyone grows together. Linda looked at the quiet sky above us. You know, she said softly, families like yours make neighborhoods stronger. Her words surprised me. Really? I asked. Of course, she said. Different cultures bring new stories, new traditions, new food. Mark nodded. And sometimes new basketball players on the street. We laughed again. Standing there in the cool night air, I realized something important. What began as a broken car had turned into something much more meaningful. A conversation about life, about family, about the strange ways different cultures meet and blend. And the entire conversation had been happening in English. Not perfect English, but real English. Living English. The kind you remember forever. Mark looked at my car and then back at me. Well, he said with a small grin. Your car is running. Linda added with a smile. And now we know our neighbor a little better. The night felt peaceful again. But one more moment was still waiting to happen. Because sometimes the most important lesson comes right before you drive away. The car problem solved. The engine kept running, steady and calm, like a patient heart that had finally decided to cooperate again. For a moment we all stood there quietly, listening to the soft mechanical rhythm. The rain had disappeared completely now, leaving the street fresh and shining under the yellow glow of the streetlights. It felt like the storm had ended exactly when the problem was solved. Mark stepped back and folded his arms, studying the car like a doctor checking a patient after surgery. Well, he said with a satisfied nod. That sounds healthy. I laughed softly, relief spreading through my chest. You might have saved my entire evening. Mark shrugged in a relaxed way. Sometimes problems look bigger than they really are. That sentence sounded simple, but my brain held onto it for a moment. Because that idea applies to many things in life, not only cars. It also applies to learning English. Many language learners imagine that speaking English requires perfect grammar, perfect pronunciation, and a perfect vocabulary. But the truth is much simpler. Communication works with imperfect tools. just like this car. A small loose connection had stopped the entire machine. Tightening one tiny piece allowed everything else to work again. Mark leaned closer to the engine one last time and tapped a small metal connector with his finger. This cable was slightly loose, he explained. When the connection weakens, the engine can lose power. I nodded, trying to understand the explanation. He continued, cars depend on small connections. Electricity flows through tiny wires. If one piece fails, the whole system can stop. Linda, still standing near the porch, smiled. That sounds like a life lesson. Mark laughed. It usually is. And suddenly I realized something interesting. Languages also depend on connections. Not mechanical ones. Human ones. Words connect people. Sentences connect ideas. Conversations connect lives. When those connections work, communication flows. Mark closed the hood again and wiped his hands with a towel. You should be able to drive now, he said. I opened the car door and sat inside. The seat was slightly cold from the damp air, but the engine's warmth slowly filled the cabin. I placed my hands on the steering wheel and took a deep breath. Then something funny happened. My brain suddenly started noticing the English words from the entire evening. Battery, engine, connector, turn the key, try again. These were not words from a textbook lesson. They were words connected to a real moment. And research in neuroscience explains why those words would now stay in my memory much longer. When the brain learns language during emotional or meaningful experiences, it releases chemicals like dopamine, which strengthen memory formation. In simple terms, the brain remembers better when something interesting or important happens. That rainy night had certainly been interesting. I rolled down the window and looked at Mark and Linda. Thank you again, I said sincerely. Mark waved his hand dismissively. Neighbors help neighbors. Linda nodded. That's how communities work. Their answers were simple, but they carried something powerful, kindness, without expectation. Modern life sometimes makes people believe that everyone is too busy to help. But moments like this prove something different. Kindness still exists in quiet places. I turned off the engine for a second and stepped back outside the car again. I want to ask something, I said. Mark looked curious. What's that? Why did you come outside to help me? Mark looked toward the dark sky for a moment before answering. Well, he said slowly, I saw someone standing in the rain next to a broken car. He shrugged. And I remembered being that person once. Linda added gently, everyone needs help sometimes. That answer felt deeper than any complicated explanation. Human beings understand each other through shared experiences, broken cars, difficult days, moments when life refuses to cooperate. Mark leaned against the car again. So tell me something, he said. What's the biggest challenge when learning English? I thought about the question for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Fear. Fear. Linda asked. Yes, I said. Fear of speaking wrong. Fear of making mistakes. Mark smiled knowingly. That fear disappears one conversation at a time. He pointed toward the three of us. Tonight was one of those conversations. And he was absolutely right. Earlier that evening, I had been sitting alone in my car, feeling frustrated and tired of practicing English. Now I was standing outside with neighbors having a real conversation in that same language. The fear had quietly disappeared somewhere along the way. Not because my English suddenly became perfect, but because the conversation became more important than perfection. I climbed back into the driver's seat and started the engine again. The sound felt strong and confident now. Mark tapped the roof of the car lightly. "Drive safe," he said. Linda waved from the porch. "Tell your family you had an adventure tonight." I smiled. "I definitely will." As I slowly pulled away from the curb, I glanced back once more. Mark and Linda stood under the porch light, waving like old friends. The street looked peaceful again, but inside my mind something had changed. That rainy night had started with frustration, doubt, and a broken machine. Yet somehow it had turned into one of the most valuable English lessons I had ever experienced. And strangely enough, the real lesson of the night had not even begun to reveal itself yet. A lesson I never forgot. The road looked different when I started driving again. Strangely different. It was the same street, the same houses, the same streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement. But something inside my mind had quietly shifted. Just 30 minutes earlier, I had been sitting in the same car feeling tired, frustrated, and ready to give up practicing English for the night. Now I was driving home with a completely different energy. Not because my English had suddenly become perfect, but because something much more important had happened. A real conversation. A human moment. The kind that no textbook can create. The car rolled slowly through the quiet neighborhood. Water from the tires whispered against the wet road as I turned the corner toward my house. And while driving, my brain began replaying the evening like a short movie. The broken engine. Standing alone in the rain. The light turning on in Mark's window. The first simple sentence. "Hey, are you okay over there?" It's funny how small moments can become turning points. Psychologists sometimes describe these experiences as micro-transformations, tiny events that slowly change the way we see ourselves. That night had quietly changed something in my relationship with English. For years I had thought about English mostly as a skill to improve. Vocabulary,
grammar,
pronunciation. But that evening reminded me of something more important. English was not the goal. Connection was. Language was simply the bridge. The car stopped at a red light near the end of the street. The engine hummed gently while I waited. I looked at my reflection in the windshield and laughed quietly. Just an hour earlier I had been worried about making mistakes while speaking. But during the conversation with Mark and Linda, mistakes didn't matter at all. The communication still worked. And that is something research in language learning confirms again and again. According to studies in applied linguistics, fluency grows faster when learners focus on meaning instead of perfection. In other words, when you focus on sharing ideas instead of avoiding mistakes, your brain relaxes and language flows more naturally. The traffic light turned green. I drove the final few blocks toward my house. My neighborhood was quiet now. Most homes had their lights dimmed. Curtains were closed. Families were probably finishing dinner, watching late-night shows, or preparing for sleep. When I parked in the driveway, the engine ticked softly as it cooled down. I sat there for a moment without moving. My mind kept returning to one sentence Mark had said earlier. Sometimes problems look bigger than they really are. He was talking about the car. But the sentence applied perfectly to language learning too. Many learners believe English is a mountain too tall to climb. They imagine years of study before they can speak comfortably. But in reality, progress often happens through small steps. One conversation, one story, one unexpected rainy night. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. The air felt cool and peaceful after the storm. Clouds were slowly drifting apart, revealing a few small stars above the neighborhood. Inside the house, warm light glowed through the windows. My family was still awake. As soon as I opened the door, my son looked up from the couch.
"Dad,
"You're late." I smiled. I had a small adventure. My wife walked into the hallway and raised an eyebrow. "Adventure?" I hung my wet jacket near the door.
"Car trouble," I said.
Her eyes widened slightly. "Are you okay?" "Yes," I said quickly. "The neighbors helped." I explained the entire story while we sat at the kitchen table, Mark fixing the engine, Linda bringing coffee. The conversation about families and life. My children listened with curiosity. When I finished, my daughter laughed. "So, you practiced English while fixing the car?" I smiled. "Yes." My son grinned. "That's the best way to learn." Kids often understand things adults complicate. For them, language is simply a tool for talking, laughing, asking questions. No fear.
No perfection.
Just communication. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat quietly for a few minutes thinking about everything that had happened. The rain, the broken car, the kindness of neighbors, and the unexpected English practice that came with it. Sometimes life teaches us lessons when we least expect them. Not through formal classes, not through study plans, but through real moments that force us to participate. Before turning off the kitchen light, I whispered something quietly to myself. If every English lesson felt like this, nobody would ever quit learning. And that thought stayed with me long after the night ended. Because the truth is simple. The most powerful language lessons are not the ones you memorize. They are the ones you live. But the story of that rainy night still had one more chapter waiting. And that chapter would change my motivation in a way I never expected. A new motivation to learn. Motivation is a strange thing. Some days it feels powerful, like a strong wind pushing you forward. You wake up ready to learn, ready to practice, ready to improve. Other days it disappears completely. No energy, no focus. Just a quiet voice in your mind saying, "Maybe tomorrow." That night, after the rain and the broken car and the long conversation with my neighbors, I thought a lot about motivation. Not the loud, exciting kind people talk about in motivational speeches, but the quiet kind, the kind that slowly grows after a meaningful experience. The next morning began like any ordinary day. Sunlight came through the kitchen window. The storm from the night before had completely disappeared. The sky looked clear and calm, like nothing unusual had ever happened. But inside my mind, something had changed. While making coffee, I suddenly remembered Mark's voice from the night before. Sometimes problems look bigger than they really are. He had been talking about the car, but my brain had connected that sentence to something else. English. For years I had sometimes treated English like a huge mountain. Something difficult, complicated, maybe even exhausting. Vocabulary lists, grammar rules, listening exercises that felt slow and repetitive. But the conversation with Mark and Linda had revealed something important. Real English was not a mountain. It was a bridge between people. That realization may sound simple, but psychologists say these small mental shifts are powerful. When the brain connects learning with meaningful experiences, motivation increases naturally. This process is called intrinsic motivation, the desire to do something because it feels meaningful, not because someone forces you. And that morning, for the first time in a long while, practicing English felt meaningful again. After breakfast, my daughter sat at the kitchen table doing homework. She looked up and asked, "Dad, what did the neighbors say when they helped you?" I smiled. They asked simple questions. Like what? I thought for a moment. "Are you okay?" I said. She nodded thoughtfully. "That's easy English." "Yes," I laughed. "But very important English." Sometimes learners underestimate the power of simple phrases. Short sentences often carry the most human meaning. Are you okay? Do you need help? Where are you from? How was your day? These questions open doors to conversations. And conversations create connection. Later that afternoon, I decided to do something different with my English practice. Instead of opening a textbook, I opened a small notebook. At the top of the page, I wrote a title, Rainy Night Story. Then I began writing the entire experience from memory. The broken car, the rain, Mark's flashlight, Linda's coffee, the story about how they met in the diner. The more I wrote, the more I noticed something interesting. My brain was remembering vocabulary naturally. Engine, connector,
Then,
conversation, family. Words connected to emotions stay in memory longer. Neuroscientists explain that emotional experiences activate deeper memory networks in the brain. In simple terms, the brain remembers stories better than lists. That afternoon, I realized something important about language learning. If you only study English as a school subject, motivation eventually fades. But if English becomes the tool that helps you share your life story, motivation returns. Because everyone has stories. Stories about family. Stories about mistakes. Stories about unexpected nights when strangers become friends. Later that week, something surprising happened. I saw Mark again. He was standing in his driveway washing his car. When he noticed me walking by, he waved. "Hey Alex," he called. This time my brain didn't freeze. There was no nervous pause. No fear of speaking. Instead, I walked over with a smile. "Hey Mark," I said. "The car is still running perfectly." He laughed. "Glad to hear it." Then he asked the same simple question he had asked the first night. "How's the family?" And just like that, another conversation began. Easy, natural, comfortable. The kind of conversation that once felt intimidating now felt normal. Psychologists describe this process as confidence reinforcement. When the brain experiences repeated successful interactions, fear gradually disappears. Confidence is not built in one moment. It grows through many small experiences. And that rainy night had been the first spark. Looking back now, I realized something surprising. My motivation to learn English didn't return because of a grammar rule or a new study technique. It returned because of people. 2 neighbors. A broken car. A conversation under the rain. Sometimes learning doesn't need more effort. Sometimes it just needs more life. But the story still had one final piece. Because years later, that simple rainy night would reveal a lesson even deeper than I understood at the time. A happy ending. Years passed after that rainy night. Not days. Not months. Years. And yet, whenever I hear the sound of rain hitting a car windshield, my mind quietly travels back to that evening. The broken engine, the cold street, the warm kitchen, and two neighbors who decided to walk outside and help a stranger. At the time, it felt like a small moment. Just a random problem on a rainy night. But life has a strange habit of revealing the true meaning of events much later. The car, of course, continued working after that night. Mark had tightened the connection well, and I drove it for several more years without serious problems. But the real change was not mechanical. It was personal. Something about that experience stayed inside my mind. After that night, I began practicing English differently. Before, my learning routine had looked like many language learners' routines. Vocabulary lists,
Grammar exercises.
listening drills. Useful, yes, but sometimes tiring. After the rainy night, something shifted. Instead of only studying English, I began living in English. When something interesting happened during the day, I try to describe it in English. When I walked through the neighborhood, I imagined simple conversations in my mind. If I saw someone walking a dog, my brain would quietly practice. Nice dog. What breed is it? How old is he? These small mental rehearsals train my brain to stay ready for real conversations. Psychologists often explain that the brain learns faster when practice feels natural rather than forced. And the best natural practice comes from daily life situations. Grocery stores,
Parks.
workplaces, neighborhood sidewalks. Every place where people interact becomes a small classroom. But the story didn't end there. Over time, Mark and Linda stopped being the neighbors across the street. They became friends. We talked when we saw each other outside. Sometimes about the weather. Sometimes about our families. Sometimes about nothing important at all. And those casual conversations did something powerful. They removed the fear of speaking English completely. Many language learners imagine that fluency arrives suddenly one day, like flipping a light switch. But in reality, fluency grows slowly through many ordinary moments. A short greeting, a quick joke, a question about someone's day. Each conversation adds a small piece of confidence. Years later, one afternoon, my son came home from school excited. "Dad," he said, "we have a storytelling project." Storytelling? I asked.
Yes.
"We have to tell a real story in English." He looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you have any good stories?" I smiled immediately. "Oh, I have one." That evening we sat at the kitchen table together, and I told him the entire story. The rain, the broken car, Mark's flashlight, Linda's coffee. The conversation that began with a simple question. "Hey, are you okay over there?" My son listened carefully. When the story finished, he laughed. "So, your English practice started with a car problem?" I nodded. "Exactly." Then he said something simple but very wise. "That means problems can be useful." Children often understand life faster than adults.
Yes.
Problems can be useful. A broken car created a conversation. A conversation created confidence. Confidence created motivation. And motivation created progress. Sometimes the road to improvement begins exactly where things go wrong. That rainy night could have been frustrating. I could have sat alone in the car feeling angry, waiting for help, thinking negative thoughts about my English. Instead, a small moment of human kindness turned the night into something completely different. A story, a lesson, a reminder that learning language is really about learning people. Even today, when I practice English or tell stories like this one, I remember something important. You do not need perfect grammar to connect with someone. You do not need perfect pronunciation to share your life. All you need is the courage to start speaking. Because somewhere out there, someone might be standing under a porch light, ready to answer with a smile. And maybe, just maybe, that simple conversation will become a story you remember for the rest of your life. That is the quiet magic of language. It turns strangers into neighbors, neighbors into friends, and ordinary rainy nights into unforgettable memories. If this rainy night story felt simple, that is exactly the point. Real English learning does not always happen in classrooms or textbooks. Sometimes it begins with a small problem, a short conversation, and a moment of courage. A broken car in the rain became a life lesson about real communication, confidence, and human kindness. But here's the surprising part. This is only one story. Across the United States, I experienced many unexpected moments, awkward conversations, cultural surprises, funny misunderstandings, and even beautiful love stories that slowly built my confidence in English. Each story carries simple vocabulary, natural conversations, and real emotions that help you practice listening, reading, and speaking English in real-life situations. So, if you want to improve your real English listening practice, understand American daily life, and learn English through meaningful stories instead of boring lessons, you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel because the next story might be even more surprising than this one. Like the video and share it if this story reminded you that learning English can be human, warm, and real. And tell me in the comments, what small moment helped you learn English better? The next story is already waiting, and trust me, it begins with something even more unexpected.